The following is a quote attributed to Frederick Douglass. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. Today we are honored to interview someone who avidly promotes human freedom and knows a lot about the social reformer and abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, and understands what it takes for people to thrive and prosper through their hard work. Rachel Ferguson is the director of the Free Enterprise Center at Concordia University, Chicago, assistant dean of the College of Business and professor of business ethics. She is an affiliate scholar of the Acton Institute. Her commentary has been featured at the Christian Post, the Acton Power blog, Discourse Magazine, Law and Liberty, EconLib, and Online Library of Liberty. Today, we would like to center on her new, very successful book, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America, which she co-authored with Marcus Whitcher. So welcome, Rachel. We're very, very happy to have the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you so much.
Before we discuss your book, and really this is out of curiosity, how does a PhD in philosophy become interested in the functioning of markets?
Great question. So my PhD area of focus was political and economic philosophy. So I wrote my dissertation on property rights. I actually looked at David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and his critiques of John Locke. So it was really baked in from the beginning to be thinking about the overlap with economics. And of course, in the Scottish Enlightenment tradition and in the history of philosophy, economics was part of moral philosophy. It hadn't broken off and become so mathematized until later. So for those of us who are in the historical study of philosophy, it actually makes a lot of sense. So.
Okay. And how did you and Marcus Whitcher come up with the idea for this book?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that went into it, but I would say number one, I was doing a lot of work. I live and at the time worked very close to Ferguson, Missouri, and we were involved with a lot of the entrepreneurs there who really suffered from the unrest that occurred. And we were, trying to support that community as they recovered from all of that. And I'm also a big criminal justice reformer. And so we had a lot of events on campus on criminal justice reform. And slowly but surely, I was just becoming more and more involved with questions of race that were arising, obviously very hot topic right now in the United States. And I knew that the classical liberal tradition actually has a ton to say about race and discrimination. We have people who've won Nobel Prizes based on their insights into race and discrimination from a classical liberal perspective, but we're not known for that. People don't necessarily think about that when they think of classical liberals. And so I thought to myself, we need to put this all together into one place so that people can have sort of a classical liberal approach to this very hot topic. And so I did approach Marcus Whitcher because he is a student of David Beto. So if you're not familiar with David Beto, he's a very important libertarian historian who works on unusual figures like Blacks and women, before civil rights. So people like Rose Wilder Lane or Zora Neale Hurston. He's really interesting, T.R.M. Howard. So he's always finding these wonderful, interesting, unusual people. And Marcus is one of his students. And so I knew that he would really have the right kind of classical liberal perspective on some of these race issues. And so he ended up being really a blessing. We had such a great time working together as a team.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I really have enjoyed reading your book, and I learned a lot about some of these figures that you mentioned. And in a way, it sort of reads like a rediscovery of truths that we put aside or forgot. It's sort of a Black history that differs from what we get bombarded with every day. And it seems also like a less partisan history. Is this an accurate appreciation of your book?
Yeah, one of the things that we realized kind of immediately as we started writing is that not only are we in a period of time in which race is a very hot topic, but we're also in a period of increasing polarization and tribalism. And one of the great things about being a classical liberal is that I was never going to fit in anyway into the majority political sides, so to speak. And so all my life, I've been someone who can be in a room with progressives talking about criminal justice reform or ending the drug war, and then can be in a room with conservatives talking about, that the national debt is too big, right? And so I've always been in between anyway. And I thought, maybe one of the things we could offer people is a non-tribal approach to this question. Yes, it's a particular perspective because we're out and proud classical liberals, but it is something that is not Republican or Democrat. It's not really left or right. And so that will help people to think through issues one at a time rather than bundling them together the way we do with our partisan politics.
Yeah. Talking about classical liberals, you actually write that Frederick Douglass was a loud and proud classical liberal in every way. I'm quoting you here. For our Guatemalan and Latin American audiences, Frederick Douglass escaped slavery in 1838, and he went on to become a very famous abolitionist. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, I cannot recommend his autobiography enough. If you want to read a beautiful book in the English language, this is just a great one, or I'm sure there's Spanish translations as well. And Frederick Douglass is just a fascinating person. He escaped slavery and wrote a book about his escape. He wrote a second autobiography about more about his life. He ended up actually being one of the most photographed people in the 19th century because he had a really interesting, cool look. He had this great natural hair, and he was just a fascinating person. He came under the sway of a wing of the abolitionist movement that was heavily free market. Okay, William Lloyd Garrison is the great example here. And these people had a kind of Christian nonviolence approach to everything. They thought, not only should we be nonviolent in the market, right? And we shouldn't be coercing people through the state, but slavery is a form of coercion. And so they were very anti-slavery. That's a violent form of relating to one another. And so they were very serious abolitionists. And this is actually an incredibly important part of the story of the end of slavery in the United States, are these free market abolitionists. So Douglass came under their sway. He ended up being a little at first being kind of anti the Constitution because he saw it as a compromise with the South, which was William Lloyd Garrison's view. But then over time, he changed his mind. And this was actually another libertarian, Lysander Spooner, who had a big influence on him, because what Lysander Spooner said is that we should treat the Constitution like a contract. We should just read it according to the words in it, And if you read it that way, Douglass said, it's actually a great liberty document. And so he goes on to say that the problem with the United States is not its Constitution, it's whether people in America have honor enough and courage enough to live up to their Constitution. And so he went on to really critique socialism. He critiqued the union movement, which was very racist, of course, at the time, because if you can shut out other workers, you can raise your own wages, right? So he was very resentful towards those movements. He thought it was ridiculous that they would use phrases like wage slavery. He's like, let me tell you about slavery, okay? You're stuck with that job. You're not allowed to leave, And so he was really insulted by that. So he really had really typical classical liberal views in every way. And he said, if the government would just set us free and leave us alone, that would be the best situation for Black Americans. But unfortunately, they didn't do that. They put into place all sorts of legal restrictions on Black people. And so he was very, very frustrated by the end of his life. But he never gave up on the American project as an ideal. He just thought we weren't actually living out our own values.
I think I have to ask you, did slavery ever make economic sense? And should we condemn markets because once upon a time there was a market for slaves?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is the question that I think the 1619 Project takes up in the New York Times and comes on the side of the new historians of capitalism who are saying that, slavery is sort of like a great example of what markets do. It's exploitative, and that's exactly how capitalism is. And so what we do in chapter 2 of our book is we go back to the original classical liberal thinkers like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, who are immediately anti-slavery. They're abolitionists. Not only on moral grounds, but also on economic grounds. So, of course, morally, the property you have in your own labor is the basis of all property. And so you have to respect that for all human beings. And the whole idea of liberalism is that you have equally and universally applied law, right? And so they condemn it morally, but they also condemn it economically, because what they're saying, and this turns out to be true in the South, is that slavery will make a few people rich. It's sort of like piracy in that sense, right? Mm-hmm. You can exploit things and make yourself rich. But what we love about free markets is that they make everybody rich, right? They make regular, everyday workers richer. But what you see in the South are a few very wealthy plantation owners and a lot of very poor people, not only slaves, but also whites, poor whites. You do not see a burgeoning middle class that's getting wealthier the way that you do in the North, where they're working on industrial capitalism. And so, no, I would say slavery does not make economic sense from that perspective. You want a market that's lifting up everybody.
Okay, so in your book, you distinguish between private seeking and privilege seeking. I mean, you distinguish between privilege seeking and the struggle for liberty and real justice. What were abolitionists and civil rights activists like Martin Luther King really fighting for? And how are they different from social justice activists now?
Yeah, so I want to be really careful with this question, because I think Martin Luther King Jr. actually makes some very good points, even though I don't agree with the sort of progressive direction he eventually went in with his economics. And one of the points he makes is that the United States actually does give a lot to non-Black people. So, and non-Asian in some cases too, depending on what time period you're in, right? There's a lot of land that's given away. You've got the GI Bill, you've got Federal Housing Administration grants to go to college. You actually do have a lot that's being given away. And his for instance, with the 1862, I believe, Homesteading Act, right, where people can get land. And Blacks do end up getting legally shut out of a lot of those opportunities. And so I think sometimes what Martin Luther King Jr. is pointing out even early in his career is we're not privilege seeking any more than anybody else was privilege seeking, right? If we're asking for, some extra from the government. But of course, as free marketeers, what we want to say is nobody should be privilege seeking. In other words, rent seeking, looking for special favors from the government, because that's the government picking winners and losers, and that's going to distort the marketplace in various ways. And so what we want to say is, no, actually the best approach is one in which we remove the barriers. And so that's the approach that we're taking in the book, where we're looking at things like occupational licensing reform, educational freedom, economic freedom, criminal justice reform, all of the things where the state is getting in your way and not allowing you to flourish. And so I think that would be the distinction between what at least the early civil rights movement wanted and the social justice movement, where the social justice movement seems fairly committed to constant government intervention in order to achieve its goals. The early civil rights movement wanted equality under the law, and then to be able to achieve their goals on their own and through things like the group Black economy and self-help. And so you did see the civil rights movement actually split at the end. After the 1964 Anti-Discrimination Act, you saw them go in two different directions, and the split was very real. Even the churches split over whether we were going to go in the direction of asking the government for more economic intervention, or whether we were going to take advantage of the equality we have now and just move forward on our own.
One of the things that I found really interesting is that you write, and I'm quoting again, the desire of Black Americans to acquire their own property developed early on. I think this goes to the question of removing barriers. And it was very interesting to me that there was a clear understanding of the importance of property in order for human flourishing to occur. Can you tell us a little bit more about property?
Yeah, I cannot more highly recommend the book Competition and Coercion by Robert Higgs. Robert Higgs, of course, is the famous author of Crisis and Leviathan. But this is a great study he does on Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction America, Black America. And he's showing just how, and there's another book by a guy named Swearingen who works on Black property rights as well in this period. And they both just show so clearly how much Black freedmen wanted their own farms. They wanted to run their own businesses. They were excited about participating in the American project. And then they just end up getting blocked at every turn. You don't have courts that are really honoring their property rights. They're not honoring their contracts. So if they make a deal with a white person, the white person can just kind of renege after the work is done, and nobody's going to force them to honor that contract. So it really goes to show how important it is to have equality before the law, right? To have the rule of law, of just law, right? To have the rule of just laws in order for people to be able to flourish economically. And so what post-Reconstruction Blacks end up really having to do in the South is enter into sharecropping deals. And that's the workaround. They still make progress because they have the freedom to leave. So they can use that threat power, right? To say, well, I'm going to go over to Planter Smith's farm, or I'm going to move from the lower South to the upper South. And so they are able to bid up their shares, but it's obviously not what they really wanted in terms of an ideal. They wanted to own their own land. And where we really see a victory here is at a place like Hampton Institute in Virginia, where you get such an emphasis on ownership and entrepreneurship that you see the highest rates of Black property ownership in the country in Virginia. And that really ends up being the middle and upper class Black people who fund and run the civil rights movement eventually. So it's all part of that long story of civil rights.
Yeah. Again, for the benefit of our Latin American audiences, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, but soon thereafter came what are known as the Jim Crow laws, right, at a local and state level that legalized racial segregation for another 100 years. And you narrate in detail, I guess, several cases of violence and abuse committed against Black Americans. And you suggest that applying transitional justice would help heal the wounds of racial discrimination and segregation. I think this is a lesson that it has validity for our region as well. Can you explain how transitional justice is distinct from social justice?
Yeah, great question. I think that social justice is a term that's very hard to nail down. And so what do we mean? What does it consist of? And so it can be so nebulous and so abstract that it can seem to require almost anything. It's very difficult to nail it down. Where transitional justice is different, this is a term that we get from the international community, where there's deep thinking about society-wide injustices like apartheid or apartheid-like situations, which is exactly what we had in the United States, a sort of apartheid-like system. And so you don't just have individual crimes from one person against another, but you also have a kind of societal approval of these behaviors, right? And so it can be a lot more complicated how to go back and address those. What transitional justice wants to do is keep the addressing of those issues hyper local. So keep it in the local town where it occurred, very concrete. So looking at particular instances, and then thinking through what we need to do, either to, well, maybe both, to rectify the injustice. But even if that's not possible, right? It could be that we're past the point where we can rectify it. We can properly memorialize it. And so you're seeing a couple of examples of that going on in the United States. So for instance, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we had the famous massacre in 1921 of the Greenwood. There was a Black area of town, very well-off Blacks who were doing very well. Their whole town was burned down, and we think that hundreds of them were killed, and the rest of them were exiled. In that massacre, we now have the town of Tulsa, Oklahoma, doing an archaeological dig in order to find out what actually occurred and the extent of the killings and so forth. In another examples in California, You have a beach that a Black family named the Bruces bought and set up so that there would be a Black beach because Blacks were not allowed on the white beaches. After harassing them a lot, the city finally just took their land through eminent domain. And finally, now it's worth millions of dollars, of course, because it's a California beach. And so finally, the city, which still owned the land, returned it to the Bruce family, which of course is exactly what should happen. That's what's just. It was their property. It was taken unjustly. And so it's now been returned to the Bruce family, and they can realize the gains from the real estate benefits. And that sort of thing ought to be done broadly, but very concretely. So not too abstract, right? But very, very concrete.
Great. On another topic, what role has the Black church played in contributing to its members' well-being?
Huge. It kind of can't be overstated. So we quote Lincoln and Mamiya's really famous line, which is that the Black church is the cultural womb of Black America. One of the most important elements of this, of the rise of evangelical Christianity among Black people, which of course is 250 years old, goes way back, is that that idea of the imago Dei, being made in the image of God, really struck them while they were still enslaved. And so it created a kind of self-esteem and a kind of drive for freedom that you don't always see among enslaved groups. And so there was a dream of freedom that was actually mapped onto the story of the Exodus, right? So they're looking at the way that God frees the Hebrews from the Egyptians, and they're really seeing white Americans, or at least the planter class, as the Egyptians in this case, and that God is going to free them. And so there was a confidence that that was coming and that that was going to happen. So whether or not the Northerners were really trying to free slaves, which I think might be an overstatement. I don't know that they cared all that much about that. They wanted to maintain the Union. But nevertheless, as soon as this opportunity arose, so many Black slaves rose up and took advantage of what was going on in order to claim their freedom from the Union Army and run to the army and take their freedom, so to speak. And so they, in a sense, forced things in that direction. And I think that comes from the church. And then after emancipation, the church is really responsible for the huge leap forward in literacy that we see among the Black population. It's almost miraculous how quickly they all learn to read because they want to read the Bible. Right. And we could go on and on about music and other things that come out of the church and provide a kind of nexus of cultural life for Black Americans.
I also like very much the idea that the Black church models a type of behavior toward the other members of society, and the healing can come from Christian views of how it is that we should treat each other.
That's so important because we really can't underestimate how ethically sophisticated the nonviolent political action of the civil rights movement really was. And part of that sophistication is that Black people cared about the souls of white Americans. They cared as much about the perversion of the white soul as they cared about the perversion of their own soul that racism was causing. And so there was a love for even their oppressors there that is so touching and so amazing. And I think part of the reason that the movement was so successful, and part of the power of that movement, that's one of the reasons why I'm frankly just angry and insulted when I hear Black Lives Matter people say things like, this isn't your grandma's civil rights movement, like as though their belief in violence is somehow superior to the approach that the civil rights movement took. It's like, I can't even believe this. They have done nothing but undermine the good goals that we might have for more racial justice in the United States with their violence and their far left revolutionary rhetoric, as opposed to what their grandmothers did under much harder circumstances than the circumstances that they're in. It really makes me angry. Don't get me started.
I want to follow up on that because in your conclusion, you write something that I really love this ending that you have. It's by removing laws that needlessly criminalize and punish people, and by removing barriers to their economic participation, America can free already existing Black social institutions from unnecessary constraints, thus empowering Black Americans to pursue full human flourishing. I think that sort of sums up the purpose of your book, and how are people reacting to your message?
Well, so far, very well, which is probably because I'm presenting to a lot of conservative and classical liberal audiences. No, I don't know exactly how the term conservative, I don't know what that means in Central America, but in the United States, there's at least traditionally been a lot of cooperation between classical liberals and conservatives, because conservatives saw themselves as conserving the classical liberal founding, right? The American tradition in that regard. And so what I think they're hearing is, okay, I used to think of people who fought for racial justice as sort of being stalking horses for socialism, because of the way that the civil rights movement did veer, later in its evolution. And what I'm saying is, you don't have to do that. You don't have to have a socialist approach to racial justice. As a matter of fact, that's not the approach that's going to be most effective. Actually, a small government approach to racial justice is what's going to be most effective. And so I think that's really attractive to conservatives and classical liberals who do care about doing right by our history, and they do care about uplifting the Black community in the United States, but they're frustrated by the fact that it feels like if you want to support those things, you have to be left-wing, and they just know that won't work either, and so they feel trapped, I think. And what I'm trying to do with the book is give them that third way to do both racial justice and be pro-market and pro-small government.
Great. And do you think there are some important lessons that can be applied elsewhere from this experience?
Yeah, no, I really do hope so. I think, once again, I'm not an expert, obviously, on justice issues in other places necessarily, but I do think that there is a tendency to assume that if we care about the least well off, if we care about the poor, if we care about the downtrodden or people who've been historically oppressed, we've got to be on the left. And I would love to break up that assumption, right? And get people to see that we can be small government and pro-market and really pro-poor and pro-oppressed, right, people, and standing up for their rights. And if you look back at the classical liberal tradition, you see this. I mean, Edmund Burke fought for the rights of the Irish and people in India against the government of England. And he's considered the great conservative, right? But he was standing up for the marginalized. He absolutely was. And you can see the same thing with Smith and Mill and others being abolitionists, right? People like Rose Wilder Lane writing for the biggest Black national newspaper and making libertarian pro-Black arguments and waking up the white community to problems of lynching and things like that. So I hope we can bring those things together, use our moral imagination in our approach.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for this interview. And I really want to encourage all of our audience to look up the book, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America. I guarantee you are going to enjoy it very much. And for more important information regarding Instituto Fe y Libertad, its work, activities, and what we discussed in this episode, you can visit feylibertad.org, our sites on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, this was great. Great to see you, Carroll.
Thank you. Thank you very much.